over the last 20 years of working with students, that phrase, my truth, has just expounded and expounded. And I've always felt insane because I always want to look at somebody and say, that's not a thing.
Yeah.
Like you don't get to own it. You get to own your experiences and your feelings and your story, but you don't get to own truth. And in this book, you unpack, you reverse engineer, like here's where this started.
Right.
And I've always been both mystified and, I hate to use this word, like exhilarated and really frustrated with Freud. Really annoyed by Descartes. And you took them both and we're like, here we go.
Yeah.
So unpack, how do we get to this place where we've landed in a world where there's no truth and we're all trying to just make our way? It's mapless, right?
Well, Descartes kind of introduced radical skepticism, and so kind of undermined just our feeling that we are actually making contact with anything real. And so introduce a radical subjectivism to just the way we perceive reality. Freud is probably more well-known culturally, where he's throwing you back in upon yourself to delve into the murky unconscious and discover your true self. And I think that has emerged into what you're describing with young people. Like if I can go in myself, find my truth, then somehow that'll be the secret of mental health. That'll be the key that will unlock joy and happiness in my life. By pulling us inside of ourselves, I think we've lost touch with basic transcendent realities. I think we've lost touch with the empirical world, and I think we've lost touch with other people. And I think social media has exacerbated that.
How so?
Just because it's just more of a lens where I'm peering at myself through the gaze of other people. It's still very self-referential. I'm throwing myself out there, and I'm seeing how others perceive me, and I'm still locked in a funhouse room of mirrors.
That's all you.
Distorting effects. I'm just seeing screens all the time, and I can't ever ground or get a real, clear, true, authentic vision, of myself.
What do you do with that?
What do I do with that?
Yeah, well, because I've got a 8-year-old.
Yeah.
And she crossed the finish line in her first cross country race. It was a mile, whatever. She did so good. She runs across and it was amazing. And I was cheering. And the first thing, gotta see the video.
Yeah.
And part of me thinks, cool. And part of me thinks, hey, up until 1980, that had never happened in human history. So we can't have the neurological wiring to have this sort of this immediate feedback loop. I did a thing, I want to see it. I did a thing, I want to see it. That's never existed. That can't be, I'll say healthy is probably a bad way to say it, but to just drop a whole generation of human into this and say, go forth, that's unmooring, right?
Right. Well, I think the modern self and the modern ego has become increasingly like self-referential. Like the self staring back at itself, and in this case, staring into another screen or into another video of myself. And because of that self-referential nature, the self is perpetually unsettled. And I think one of the things we do with that is we start giving younger generations better advice. For a generation, we have thought, following Freud, if we could just throw young people back in their minds in a pursuit of self-esteem.
If
you can somehow see yourself as valuable and worthy. And so we're trying to achieve mental health through like self-regard.
Yeah.
But the trouble is self-regard is a very up and down experience. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride, and it fluctuates with successes and its failures. And so I think fundamentally what we've done by trying to achieve, mental health through self-regard is we've destabilized the mental health of a generation.
Yeah.
We've given them bad advice. Or as I describe in the book, we're smoking cigarettes thinking we're going to cure cancer.
Okay, so in what I would say, like in non-nerd parlance here, like between two guys, we've told a generation, it goes back to you're healthy no matter what. You are beautiful no matter what. You are strong and wonderful no matter what. And my kid knows I just got 42nd in a race. I'm not. And when the parents rush and be like, you're the best, you crushed, here's a trophy, like they know innately that's not true. And then we launch them out and say, just keep looking in the mirror and telling yourself how, whatever narrative you want to say, and that's how you'll achieve wellness. And it's not true. And it's this strange unraveling, right? And then the only thing they've got left to do is then go in my experience, and you work with more students than I've experienced over my career, the only thing they can go do is get a dollar amount or a certificate because they have to get some sort of external validation that I've got some value because I keep saying the right things in my head and it's not working.
Yeah.
It's not working.
Well, the other thing I describe in the book is what you're describing is what psychologist Ernest Becker called a hero game or a status game. And so it's not just mental health through self-regard. It's also through playing some sort of game where I'm winning some sort of blue ribbons. And it could be athletic performance. It could be financial. For me, it could be a book sale, student evaluations. There's always some metric out there that I'm pursuing that will reflect back to me my inherent value or status. But like your daughter experienced, but there's always going to be somebody that runs faster. Most corporate successes are governed by a hierarchy. At some point, those positions get scarce, and I'm not going to make it to the next level. Book sales can go up or down.
Right.
Views on Instagram can go down. And so, again, you're destabilizing mental health because you're attaching significance to something that could be lost, or that's something that could be diminished in a moment of social comparison. I'm doing great until I bump into somebody that's more successful than I am.
Yeah.
And so you're still stuck in a game that's either inherently competitive. I'm always contrasting myself with somebody who's successful, or I'm chasing some ring, or I am feeling like a failure. So I'm experiencing shame or whatever. So again, your mental health is just registering how that game is going, winning or losing. And that's not a good place to be. That's not a place of tranquility or peace or calm. It just creates more anxiety.
One of my students at Texas Tech.
Okay.
And everyone will know who he is. I've had him on the show before. He's a very successful attorney. One of the kindest guys I've met. Brilliant. Just 10 or 15 years younger than me. Went in his car and started, once a day, I'm just going to make an Instagram video. I think he's up to like 7 million, followers. Just stumbling through, literally just offering kind, solid wisdom from his experience as a trial attorney. And I can't help but look over at one of my former students and be like, yeah, he played on the other day, though, and his tickets, you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
What is it? What I can't figure out, I get comparison, I get the game, I get all that, it's not healthy, yada, yada. I don't understand the mechanism by which it continues to work because I know better, is what I'm saying. I have every objective measure. I can't. It's the strangest thing that you keep looking over, right? And not going, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with that because I know every study. I know every objective reality. And you look over. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't have a map for it. Or maybe it's just straight up, I don't want to hear it, but maybe it's just straight up discipline. Stop.
Yeah, it could
It's
be.
almost like old Bob Newhart, just quit.
Yeah.
Stop.
I mean, I also think, given what we know about the mind, it's one thing to know something, like rationally, propositionally, verbally.
Yeah.
It's another thing to have the emotional scripts for it.
Yeah.
And you could probably verbalize the path to a good life.
Right.
And a psychologist can point the way to mental health or resiliency. But the deeper emotional logics, the way we've been formed by our upbringing, the things that we care about, those heart issues, those are more stubborn.
Yeah.
And how to change those can take a lifetime. I was once at a place speaking, and my host was just visiting with me about his life. We were just getting to know each other. And he said to me, and this haunts me to this day, he's talking about his father and how that relationship wasn't very good. His father wasn't a kind person. And so there was a lot of pain in that relationship. He said, but late in life, there was this great grace where my father became kinder, and I was blessed to have this final moment with him during the final years of his life where I felt like we really kind of got to see each other clearly. And then after he describes that journey, he says this. He goes, well, it takes a lifetime to become a human being. And I think for your journey, my journey, I think we're all in some degree caught up in that process of becoming a human being. And it's going to take a very long time for us to unlearn a lot of that stuff.
But culturally, we don't have the grace for each other to, you know what I mean?
To be patient with each other and ourselves in that journey.
It's almost like watching my daughter take her first steps on the track yesterday and expecting her to be an Olympian and just burning her to the ground.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, our children become a part of those hero games.
They do.
Their metrics of success
They're
reflect back
our
on us.
ribbons now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And they can't carry that.
And that's increasingly so in middle class, upper class America, where kids are now the proxies for competition.
That's right.
Getting into, I mean, it starts at kindergarten, getting into a good kindergarten, getting into a good school, getting into good internships, and the portfolios of our children reflecting back upon our status.
How good am I doing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Why is a world led by everybody's feelings so dangerous?
Well, like I said, I think because those feelings are, they're going to be knee-jerk reactions. They're going to be our hot takes. They're going to be our non-deliberative attitudes towards life. And a lot of those are going to reflect the wounding of our past as well. So they're going to come out kind of disordered or misdirected.
What are feelings?
Well, I mean, a psychologist would describe feelings as, you know, an affectively valenced reaction to a life event.
Okay.
Triggered by, so if I feel threat, I feel anxious. If I experience loss, I feel depressed. If I see harm and cast blame, I'll feel anger. That's emotions. That's just an emotional reaction to an event. Then there's like our moods, our emotional temperament.
Yeah.
And so some of us are wired more for hostility. Anger is going to be more in play. Some of us might be wired more for worry and anxiety. Some of us might be worried for more melancholy or depression. And so there's also kind of the backdrop of those emotions that bring certain affects into my life given what I'm feeling. Okay. And so that's all a little bit different too. But I mean, from a biological perspective, it's supposed to be information. Emotions are trying to tell us something important. So you should pay attention to those emotions. The trouble though is if they aren't tethered to reality or they've been distorted in some way by a hero game or some trauma I've experienced, then the information I'm getting about the world isn't accurate. Like, as you know, in your work on anxiety, I have an alarm bell going off in my head, and that has some adaptive purpose. But if I'm misperceiving threat or over-perceiving threat, then suddenly my engine is revving in the driveway, and I'm not going anywhere, and I'm just burning myself out. But a similar thing happens with depression. People who get stuck in shame and guilt are getting information about their value that isn't accurate, or people who are struggling with chronic anger. They're seeing harms, even in a paranoid way, that aren't there as well.
Right.
So that's the issue with feelings, is the degree to which they really do correspond with reality, because the felt intensity of an emotion is so overwhelming that they just got to be real and true and accurate.
Right.
And any sort of rational evidence giving. Like, if you ever try to talk self-esteem into a child.
Yeah.
Those words are kind of penetrating the frontal cortex, and I'm processing the sentences, but at the deep emotional level, I don't feel very good about myself.
That's right.
In the same way, trying to talk somebody out of anxiety.
I want to talk about self-esteem, self-affirmation, manifesting, and I guess I say this, you're the first person that I've read it outside of my own journal. So kudos to you. The mess we've made of trauma. And I'll just read what I wrote down. We can't self-esteem ourselves out of a traumatic past. We can't say nice things to ourselves in the mirror to trauma things away. And we can't sit on a therapist's couch or in a pastor's office or scrolling for Instagram quips for years on end trying to solve our past. And here's my big, what I would call, to quote Huberman, anecdata. I haven't seen the randomized controlled study, but I just keep seeing it over and over and over. Trauma over time becomes an identity marker, becomes currency, becomes my entry and exit in and out of a room. And then feelings about truth become this weird arbiter of reality. And suddenly we've lost all rational perspective of everything. And my calling card is Well, you've been hurt. Check this out.
Yeah.
And then it's check this out, and it's check this out. And I have to back up as a guy who entered into the mental health world and say, we're hurt. We've harmed people. Like we have put people in the corner and said, you're the worst thing that ever happened to me. I'm going to pat you on the head. You just stay there. We'll take care of it for you. And I'll speak on that because I got a broader question about it. But what do we do with that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. One is it's an illustration of what we were describing earlier, the Freudian turn. Because the Freudian turn was the way to heal from trauma is to go back into that trauma and revisit that trauma. And I think what we're seeing now in the scientific literature is that revisitation, rumination over trauma, the excessive introspection of a great deal of modern psychotherapy that goes back to Freud is actually not helping anymore. It's actually making people worse.
It's a re-interest, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I describe in the book a little bit about how with the rise of like cognitive behavioral and acceptance-based therapies, how there was a concern that revisiting trauma actually was doing more harm than good, and a need to step back a little bit more objectively toward that. And so there's that whole part that I think the mental health profession is beginning to be concerned about introspective ruminating, especially about trauma, and beginning to question the Freudian assumption that that's always a good thing.
Right.
That maybe mental health and resiliency is better achieved by moving forward and cultivating resiliency. And to your point, not defining yourself by your trauma, and not a perpetual victimization of oneself.
Right.
I think the other thing is the politics of trauma.
That's
what you're describing, where if I show up in a space as a trauma victim, there is a kind of social or political power in speaking from that location of trauma. And I think we're also having a debate about that as well, about the degree to which the politicization of trauma is playing out in modern discourse, because it can be a form of control. Claiming trauma or being traumatized can make me control a space.
It shuts down.
Yeah,
you become the king of the room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we're seeing that language of trauma and mental health just creeping into everyday discourse.
Right.
And even I use the word trigger. So a word that goes all the way back to Vietnam vets and post-traumatic stress disorder, where it had an appropriate language, like certain stimuli would trigger a flashback from the jungle or something I witnessed. Now, anything I see is being given a framework of a post-traumatic stress reaction. And so that's something we're currently navigating, is about the overuse of mental health language in everyday discourse, because it can be a form of control.
And I guess my concern for I would take ownership of my community is I have to be objective and look at the data. More people than ever before in human history are under the care of some sort of licensed professional. More psychotropic medications being doled out than ever before. Like all these things that we said will solve it, whatever it is. It's not. Like you got to look at the data. It's not, right? Or it is contributing to. It just feels like a mess. It feels like a mess.
Well, it's a paradox too, because in one sense, we've never had more attention and resources allocated to mental health care, as you said. Most people ever in therapy or on medication. And yet we're also lamenting at the very same time a skyrocketing mental health crisis. So whatever we're throwing at the problem
it's not solving
is not solving the problem and may be exacerbeting the problem.
There you go. Yeah. So what's the fine line here? I wrote this question down. What is the fine line between advocacy and disempowerment? How do I see a group who's been marginalized, hurt, or a person who has been through it and say, I see you and I love you and I'm on your team and I'll fight on your behalf where you can't. And it's and I don't know how to find that balance between helping and supporting and walking alongside and overdoing it.
Yeah, and it probably just depends on the scale of the problem. I mean, there's one thing, mental health discourse, so something like this conversation can help recalibrate that conversation. There's obviously policies, but some of this is just individual discernments about how I parent or perceive my own trauma. And so the solutions will depend on what scale we're looking at. But I do think you're seeing the pendulum start swinging. I think people are realizing now that those capacities for resiliency have atrophied, and thus we're going to need to kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit on parenting, education, mental health practice, and just discourse to think about grit, perseverance, courage, and also how to just deal with pain. I think there's also a sense of America right now that suffering is just a bad, and thus we've lost a capacity, kind of a stoical capacity for suffering. And so we want to medicate ourselves out of it or affirm our ways out of it because we assume it's a pathological condition. But you're seeing writers like Brene Brown and Kate Bowler talk about, like, she talks about there's no cure for being human. Yeah. Her point being that there aren't answers for some of these things. And sometimes we will just suffer, but a capacity to suffer well, to stay courageous, to stay hopeful, to stay joyful in the midst of suffering it's a lost capacity. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that because our frame on mental health is so therapeutic, therapeutic is always trying to alleviate suffering.
Yeah.
And we've lost a religious perspective.
Yeah.
And world religions have typically seen, from Buddhism to Christianity, as suffering is integral to the human condition and thus giving us capacities to carry suffering. But
it's a feature, not a bug.
It's
right?
a feature, not a bug, right? Yeah. But nowadays with the therapeutic culture, if there's pain, we treat it.
Yeah.
And that's from the medical perspective with the opioid crisis to therapy, where if you're in distress, well, your distress has to be addressed immediately.
Yeah.
And thus we lose the capacity to deal with distress or even name appropriate levels of distress. Like the continuum from I'm just mildly uncomfortable to no, this is abusive. We don't have any ability to weigh the continuum of suffering. And so we describe mild offenses or irritations as traumatizing or unsafe because we just think any pain is pathological.